you everyone for joining us, and thank you to our partners who help us perform and help put on these events. If you're interested in learning more about the Foreign Policy Research Institute, you can go on our website, fpri.org. And so thank you for this event. This is going to be a timely discussion about burden sharing, and so I'm grateful to have three great participants joining us today. So Dr. Kyu-Yan Chung is an associate professor of political science at the Kangwon National University in South Korea. Her research focuses on U.S. foreign policy on the Korean Peninsula, security issues in the Indo-Pacific, including alliance politics, regional security, architecture, nuclear politics, and maritime security. She received her BA and MA from Korea University and her PhD in political science from UCLA in California. And our second participant, Michael Maza, is the senior director at the Project 2049 Institute. Mike analyzes U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific region, cross-strait relations, and Asian security issues. He has a master's from Johns Hopkins University and a bachelor's degree from Cornell University. And our third participant, Will Chu, is the deputy director of Hudson's Japan chair, focusing on U.S.-Japan relations in the Indo-Pacific with an emphasis on regional partnerships, defense innovation, trade, and technology. His forthcoming book, Made for America, explores U.S.-Japanese relations through the lens of commercial trade. He holds a BA from Yale and an MA and PhD from Ohio State University. So thank you for joining us here, and thanks again for our participants for coming on. So burden sharing is, probably a perennial issue for U.S. alliances, but it's probably particularly topical right now as the new Trump administration enters its second term. And Donald Trump has made this kind of a big issue for his foreign policy on trying to, even up the expenses that the U.S. pays for security of U.S. alliances. And so during his first administration, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan were particularly targeted for increased cost sharing and burden sharing to make the U.S. posture and security apparatus in Asia more affordable to the U.S. And so today we're going to try to discuss these issues a little bit further, where they're going to be going in the next 4 years, how the administration should look at this, how our allies, Seoul, Tokyo, and Taipei should be addressing these issues. But first, I want to talk with Mike about Taiwan. Taiwan is, in some ways the most critical area for U.S. defense policy and foreign policy, as China, has its ambitions on the island. It could, how the next 4 years develop will have a big impact on whether Taiwan is ready to repel an invasion or an attack, or whether the U.S. is willing and ready to, help Taiwan in that fight. But Mike, give us a sense of how Taiwan sees its defense policy, how it sees its relationship with the U.S., and how, historically, the past, decades since the U.S. broke official relations with Taiwan, how defense policy has kind of evolved in those past decades.
Yeah, sure. So, I would say that Taiwan is probably broadly happy with the U.S.-Taiwan defense relationship at this point in time. It has really made great strides over the last 10 years or so, over the last decade. And it's done so in three ways. So we've seen arms transfers pick up. So between 2020 and 2022, I believe, Taiwan was the largest purchaser of FMS foreign military sales globally. We've also seen the United States over the past couple of years introduce new ways of transferring arms to Taiwan. So for the first time, the United States is making available foreign military financing, FMS, essentially loans and grants to help Taiwan purchase arms. And it has also given the president the authority to use presidential drawdown authority to take things that are existing in U.S. military stocks and transfer them to Taiwan. That's new. The president couldn't do that prior to just a year or so ago. And all of this is, I would say, indicative of a recognition in the United States that there is greater urgency in helping Taiwan to arm up and do so more quickly. We have seen Taiwan, as far as the way its defense policy is changing, embrace something the United States has been pushing for some time, which is to embrace more asymmetric approaches to its defense. Generally, what that means is focusing on large numbers of small, survivable, affordable weapons. Um, Taiwan has slowly sort of embraced that view, slowly started to procure more of those things, but it's still buying lots of F-16s, new tanks, all of which the United States is selling, but does so with some trepidation, as the United States worries that those may not be useful in the event of an invasion. Um, as for the United States, we're trying to continue to push Taiwan to do a couple things to increase its defense spending. It has not increased at a rate that I think many Americans hoped it would over the past few years. And again, to continue shifting to an embrace of those asymmetric approaches to defending itself.
Yeah, let's talk more about, how Taiwan is purchasing these weapons and platforms. You mentioned that they're buying these kind of big, expensive platforms, F-16s, frigates, destroyers, tanks, stuff that, could get quickly blown up if, China does do an attack. But there's an argument out there that, certainly looking at like F-16s and like surface fleet capabilities, that it can deter or match kind of Chinese gray zone activities around Taiwan, and that actually there's an argument that if Taiwan is able to match or respond to Chinese gray zone activities, that actually decreases the likelihood of a Chinese attack or kinetic attack or invasion on Taiwan. How do you think about that? I mean, is there merit to that argument? Is it, not well placed? How do you think about that issue?
Yeah, no, there's absolutely merit to that argument, and I think there is a bit of a mismatch in Taiwanese and American visions for Taiwan's self-defense approach right now. The United States is, for understandable reasons, very concerned about the invasion scenario and the asymmetric capabilities that it is encouraging Taiwan to purchase and to field, are perhaps most useful in that scenario. But from Taiwan's perspective, that's not the only scenario it has to worry about. It has to worry about responding to a maritime blockade. It has to worry about dealing with possible missile barrages or air blockade surrounding the island with a military aircraft. It has to worry about, as you mentioned, gray zone tactics, things that don't rise to the level of use of force, but are coercive and inflammatory. And so asymmetric capabilities are not appropriate, are useful in responding to all those various scenarios. The other thing Taiwan has to consider is that the United States is that it doesn't have a treaty with the United States. The United States U.S. policy is to not clarify whether or not it would come to Taiwan's defense. So Taiwan has to be prepared to deal with all those scenarios on its own, and has to be prepared to deal with the invasion scenario on its own too. It can't count on the United States uh, being there to defend it, taking care of certain things so that Taiwan can narrowly focus on defending the beaches. And lastly, your initial point, I think again is quite correct. If Taiwan isn't responding to the daily air incursions in the air defense identification zone, if it's not responding when ships are acting in provocative manner, practicing to blockade, then China will be only more emboldened. And perhaps more importantly, Taiwan's people will lose confidence in the military's ability to defend the island, and that can have a corrosive impact on morale and resilience.
What's your sense of, kind of the domestic politics happening in Taiwan and the views that Taiwan has on the U.S.? You mentioned that, the U.S. does not have a formal security treaty like the U.S. has with Korea or Japan. And so, it's kind of a guess, there's an ambiguity whether the U.S. will come to Taiwan's defense. How do you view Taiwan's, commit, or how do you view Taiwan's, strength that the U.S. will come, and how do you think that's affecting Taiwan's policy, security policy, force posture? I mean, do you think it could, embolden them to develop a stronger, deterrent against China or push them towards some sort of accommodation of China.
Yeah. So one of the challenges Taiwan faces domestically is that there is not a broad political consensus on how to deal with the China threat and how to manage relations with the United States. So, I mean, you asked specifically about the United States. Um, the Democratic Progressive Party, which is the president's party in Taiwan, is places a lot of emphasis on the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So the previous president, President Tsai Ing-wen, who was also of the DPP, um, uh, spent a lot of time, put a lot of effort and resources into looking for ways to deepen U.S.-Taiwan relationship, the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Her successor, President Lai, also of the DPP, is doing the same. Members of the opposition, the KMT and the TPP, are um, are believe in the importance of the U.S. Taiwan relationship, um, but are less confident that the United States will perhaps be there in the event of a fight, and more concerned that drawing closer to the United States could dangerously provoke China. Um, this is a country facing significant political polarization as we are, and again, these issues aren't resolved. But they are playing out in real time. So we are seeing just over the last couple of weeks, the legislature, which is controlled by the opposition, the KMT and the TPP together, has slashed the proposed defense budget from the Lai administration. It didn't shrink the defense budget from last year, but it didn't grow as the Lai administration intended it to, and it shrunk as a percentage of GDP. Some of that is about differences in opinion over appropriate spending on defense. Some of that is domestic politicking, which is, I would argue, divorced from national security considerations.
Yeah, well, I want to get your input on Japan. The U.S.-Japan alliance has been a kind of cornerstone for U.S. Security policy in Asia. Talk a little bit about, the history of the U.S.-Japan alliance, why the U.S. has placed such an importance on Japan, and how Japan views its relationship to the U.S. as it kind of expands its security and foreign policy in the region.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in terms of Japan, obviously, it's very much defined. The U.S.-Japan alliance is very much defined by Japan's post-war constitution, right? Which Article 9 renounced its right to wage war and hold military forces. Of course, the Cold War. Circumstances, especially with the Korean War, necessitated the creation of the self-defense forces. And over time, the SDF has been able to sort of expand its ability to do more. This is especially in the 1990s in terms of providing rear support to the United States under regional affairs. 2001, in the aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks. The SDF was then able to participate in preventing or combating terrorism. But the real change, I think, really came in 2015 when then Prime Minister Abe, who had long run on a platform of trying to basically to revise Article 9 or to take it down, what failed to do so politically, but instead was able to allow Japan to effectively conduct collective self-defense alongside its allies. So primarily how this would play out would be in a circumstance where, say, if there is a Taiwan contingency and the U.S. intervenes, most likely, American bases in Okinawa and elsewhere in Japan would be hit by Chinese, attacks. And in that case, Japan would now be able to participate in support of the United States, partly because its homeland have been attacked, but also because its allies' forces have also been attacked. And so that was a key change in 2015 that, frankly, I think in many ways actually sort of sidestepped the need to revise the politically fraught Article 9 into something that would allow Japan to work more closely with the United States. And obviously in 2 years ago, or actually, I'm sorry, 3 years ago, the three security documents increased Japan's defense spending as well as expanded its defense capabilities, particularly in the area of counter-strike missiles. So in terms of the U.S.-Japan alliance, I mean, it's really important for a number of different reasons. Right? One is for security reasons. These are the two leading militaries in a pivotal region, and despite its own challenges, both in terms of our own military issues in terms of our defense, defense industrial base, as well as sort of staffing issues and similar issues with Japan, Japan still has a latently strong military. Second, economically, the security alliance is the foundation of our strong economic partnership as well, right? These are the number one or number three or number four world economies that lead the world in tech and mutual investment, right? Thus, essentially strengthening each other's economies and providing a great draw to the broader region in terms of the broader Pacific region, be it Southeast Asia or the Americas or whatnot. Geographically, the alliance is also very important because this is a pivotal region along the first island chain, of which includes Japan, Taiwan, Okinawa, and the Philippines, through which leads to Southeast Asia, through which 70% of the world's trade by value travels through, right? So this is provides a great deal of security and guarantee for the wider global economy. And finally, the security alliance is an affirmation of democratic values. So I think last year, when former Prime Minister Aso came to the U.S., he spoke about the U.S. and Japan forming a G2. Instead of a G7, rather a G2. In which the U.S. and Japan would take the lead in setting the rules of the international order and and encouraging others to follow, right? So this means setting up standards in terms of the rule of law, transparency, freedom of navigation. Japan is a strong democracy in a region that is, sometimes rather unstable. And so and so the Security Alliance provides the basis of a lot of their initiative, the U.S. and Japanese initiatives, to set the rules of the world order that proves to be mutually beneficial and secure for everyone involved.
Yeah, let's touch more on the kind of political constraints that Japan has, and that like all three of these countries and allies are really critical to US, force posture and defense and, security in the region, but there's always like an Achilles heel to each one of them in that, US Taiwan does not have a formal, relationship or a formal treaty which limits it. Japan, it's these political constraints and sometimes political like legal constraints, but there's also like a political constituency constraints. And as we'll talk about with Korea, there's the constraint is that it's so focused on the North Korean threat that can frustrate policymakers in Washington that want to expand the alliance. But for Japan, the political constraints, I mean, there's an argument that Kishida, who's a former Japanese prime minister, made a big, political concession of, increasing defense spending, and then paid the political price, that it contributed to his downfall in the elections. How do you see the political constraints to Japan increasing defense spending as the Trump administration comes in? I mean, how much are you anticipating the Trump administration to focus on that top line percent GDP number that he'll want? Or do you think the US is going to try to think creatively about burden sharing as they recognize that there might be those political constraints that Japan faces?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of political constraints, I think much of it is really stems from obviously, look, there were political scandals that happened in Japan over the past several years that have really hurt the sort of electoral viability of the current ruling party, right? The Liberal Democratic Party and its junior partner, the Komeito, in its coalition. Currently, the Prime Minister Ishiba, is governing Japan with a minority. It's a minority government, right? They are the largest bloc in the Diet, but they are not. They do not hold a majority, and so this creates a number of different constraints. One is that I think. I mean, there's a real question of will Japan be able to achieve the 2% of GDP defense spending that it had promised under the 2022 security documents? To do so, it would require raising taxes and raising funds to do so. However, with a minority government and with the fact that their most likely partner in a lot of the negotiations that they need to do to, say, pass the budget, which is should be coming out in the next month and a half. They would require working with parties that are much less willing to increase the tax burden on the Japanese people, who obviously have certainly encounter a lot of economic challenges in the aftermath of COVID. So that's one constraint. The other is the fact that because it's a minority government, Prime Minister Ishiba may not be treated with sufficient. Uh, I would say that there is an expectation. There's a school that believes that Prime Minister Ishiba will not be long in office and he will leave or be forced out soon after July, after the July upper house elections. There are those who believe that he actually has staying power. He might be there for another year or two. But regardless, the perception that he is a short-term lame duck prime minister may lessen the Trump administration's willingness to engage with him and put a lot of political sort of faith in him and try to negotiate with him or work cooperatively with him. And so I think this creates a number of challenges in terms of American demands for increased host nation support, which President Trump wants to quadruple from, I think, 1.7 billion to about $8 billion a year. This creates a lot of tension in terms of expectations for Japanese defense spending. While Tokyo has publicly committed to a 2% GDP for defense spending, the weakened yen, which they had originally calculated the defense spending at about 130 yen to the dollar, and it's currently about 155, decreases the value of the yen and actually Japan's ability to actually buy all the stuff that it was hoping to spend its money on. So that's creates some tension. And it also sort of creates, and I think the final barrier, I think, in terms of U.S.-Japan security cooperation, I think really is because of the weak government or sort of the minority government, it creates a challenge of sort of communicating with the Japanese people and sort of better informing them on the need for taking hard power more seriously in a increasingly insecure geopolitical situation in the region. I think the Japanese people reacted realistically to the Ukraine war, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and supported the 2022 national security documents. But there's a real concern that with the minority government and the broader sort of distaste for the LDP that the voters have demonstrated, that they're less willing to focus on these foreign policy issues and more focus on sort of kitchen table type issues, kitchen table economic issues, which, while important, may weaken sort of the U.S.-Japan relationship in important ways.
Yeah. Jumping across over to South Korea, Korea is kind of a mess right now from Washington's point of view. In December, the President Yoon declared martial law, short-lived martial law, before he was, declared it over, arrested, and is now, I think, imprisoned and facing trial. What's going on in South Korea? How do you describe the events, and how do you see South Korean foreign policy coming out of this, crisis situation?
Well, in regard to the current situation in South Korea, as you said, President Yoon declared the martial law, and it was very short-lived, less than several hours, and now he's in prison and kind of facing several trials, actually. And the reason why he actually argues that he declared a martial law is that there was a kind of electoral fraud, and also opposition party has been kind of continuously prevent President Yoon to execute its policy and kind of budget. Everything has been blocked in the Congress, so he cannot do anything. So that's kind of reason he argues that he declared martial law, but it is unconstitutional. So we will see how it works. There's a continuous trials, but at the same time, interesting thing is that the opposition party leaders, Lee Jae-myung, is less popular. Even though there was a martial law, even though the current ruling party is kind of supporting President Yoon's kind of argument, but at the same time, the opposition leader Lee Jae-myung and opposition party, their popularity is kind of decreasing. So we cannot really predict what's going to happen at the later half of this year, even though there is a kind of new elections or not, or even if there's a new elections and opposition party will win the elections, we never know. There are a number of candidates already running for a kind of potential presidential elections in the later part of this year. So everything is just chaos these days. So we will see what it works. But still, South Korea. As soon as South Korea kind of regain its normalcy after martial law declarations, the acting president, Deputy Minister Choi, acting president, he declares U.S. RK alliance is still strong, and we are continuing the cooperations with regional partners as well. So when it comes to foreign policy, everything at the working level is still ongoing. But anything like a kind of a signatory kind of policy, such as trilateral cooperations or nuclear consultative group that we kind of created during the Yoon and Biden administrations, has not been revitalized yet. We have a kind of meetings and kind of working level discussions, but there's a kind of limitations in moving another level to, forge, for instance, like conventional nuclear integrations and kind of trilateral military military exercises with Japan and United States. Stuff like that has been suspended, but still the acting presidents in maintaining commitment to sustain the foreign policy commitment that President Yoon has made.
Yeah, there's sort of like a Shakespearean tragedy to, how Korea has come across, past couple months, and that President Yoon, I think for many in Washington, saw as a bright hope for, the Indo-Pacific, and that I think he really looked to expand Korea's foreign policy with his kind of signature global pivotal state. He was becoming much more engaged in, arms sales to other, U.S. partners in not only the Indo-Pacific, but in Europe with, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And, he goes and does this martial law. And now, due to the political instability, I think the future of the relationship, as you mentioned, is kind of a big question mark. And I think Yoon might have been the, best political leader in Asia to actually, meet with Trump and kind of connect with Trump, both being kind of conservative backgrounds and maybe having a kind of tough guy attitude would have appealed. So, where does the Korean people see the future of U.S. Korean relations, especially as Trump comes in with these burden sharing demands? Some of these polls that are coming out of Korea show that Korean trust in extended deterrence and U.S. credibility of commitments are really low, and support for Korea developing its own nuclear arsenal, independent arsenal, is very high. How do you see those trends? What are pushing those trends? And then how do you think the new Trump administration is going to impact those trends?
Yeah, well, about the nuclear armament issue, it's very ironic kind of survey result. South Korea, like a more than 60% of South Koreans support U.S. RK alliances, and we see that this alliance is a big asset not only on the Korean Peninsula but also as a kind of balancing role against China and Russia and other regional threat as well. So South Korean people at the public level, the support for the U.S. RK alliance is pretty strong, and it has been consistent. But the thing is that is a opposition party. There's a kind of gap between the kind of party level, especially the opposition party, Progressive Party. Their support for the U.S. RK alliances is half of the public kind of support. But the rest of the public, even though public those who support opposition party, they still believe U.S. RK alliances is pretty strong. So there's a kind of gap. So I would like to point out that. But when it comes to nuclear armaments, well, That is not new, actually. It has been there since like Cold War. As you know, President Park Chung-hee during the Cold War kind of tried to develop nuclear weapons, but it has suspended. And during the Cold War in South Korea, there was a tactical nuclear weapon kind of deployed by the United States. So we always believe that in response to North Korea and also China and Russia, we believe that we need nuclear weapons. That's the only way to make the balance of terror on the Korean Peninsula. And this kind of sentiment has become stronger. Some of the kind of Washington experts, especially like Elbridge Colby, is during the campaign trail, mentions about kind of deploying nuclear weapon on the Korean Peninsula or kind of rearming South Korea in response to North Korea. So that kind of enabling kind of rhetoric from United States actually emboldened South Korean public's kind of view on possibility of having nuclear weapons in South Korea. But that's the kind of thing, that's why actually President Yoon kind of developed a kind of nuclear consultative group as a leverage or as a means to maintain this current stability. President Yoon and the current administration actually tried really hard to build a nuclear consultative group, and we are really working well. But as Trump actually become the president, the South Koreans again, we are really hoping for having our nuclear weapons because President Trump himself is very uncertain. We never know what's going to happen tomorrow in Washington D.C. and whether he will kind of give up a Korean Peninsula or trade or Taiwan. Every kind of different conspiracy theories are kind of prevalent after Trump administration. So that's kind of things we are worrying at this moment.
Yeah, I think, the nuclearization of South Korea on the weapons front seems like almost inevitable to me at this point. And I think, probably 6 months ago, there probably would have been a strong constituency of, defense planners in Washington that would have been, at least somewhat acceptable of South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. I think that's probably decreased quite a lot since Yoon's martial law declaration. But there's, I think a lot of increased support for U.S. redeployment of nuclear weapons to South Korea. To what extent do you see that as, a somewhat creative solution to Trump's burden sharing, demands? And that, as Will mentioned, he came to Japan with, billions of dollars in requests in order for the U.S. to maintain its, position in Japan. And he's going to probably do even more with South Korea. And I think he'll want to pull troops out of, South Korea to bring them back to the U.S. or put them on Japan or somewhere else. And, redeploying nuclear weapons almost seems like an easy solution to maintain, deterrence on the Korean Peninsula while also decreasing U.S. costs of, supporting South Korea. To what extent do you think you're seeing in Washington and in Korea of that being a real option, or is this mostly just kind of talk right now?
Actually, that was seriously discussed at South Korea ever since last year, ever since Trump administration, Trump kind of running elections. When you look at kind of after Korean War, Eisenhower administrations kind of deployed a nuclear weapon on Korean Peninsula as a way, as a kind of exchange for its new look foreign policy. And that's a kind of reminder for South Koreans that this might happen in South Korea one more time during this U.S.-China Great Power Rivalry, not just for the North Korea, but also as a way of balancing against China. United States might considering deploying tactical nuclear weapon on the Korean Peninsula. And that kind of alternative has been well received in South Korea. If South Korea cannot kind of rearming itself with nuclear weapon, then tactical nuclear weapon from the United States is a kind of good alternative. So that much South Korean public worries about North Korea's nuclear weapons, and not only for the North Korea's nuclear weapon, but their alignment with Russia and China, which is getting stronger, and they might receive kind of technology from Russia, like a missile technology, like a re-entry technology, or kind of satellite. That kind of worry actually translated into South Korea's support for the tactical nuclear weapons, and that option has been also well received in relation to, as you mentioned, cost sharing negotiation. Um, Trump already mentioned South Korea is a money machine. Which was pretty shock to South Korea because we are paying a lot of money already. But at the same time, Trump mentions about this shipbuilding industrial cooperation as well, given that United States naval capability is relatively decreasing compared to Chinese naval capability. So we are more than happy to kind of join that effort. So we are considering how these two options are like shipbuilding industries and joining more United States security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, kind of mitigating this cost share negotiations could be a kind of possibility in the later of this year or next year.
Yeah. So if the nuclear, the redeployment of nuclear weapons makes sense on a strategic sense for security, vis-a-vis North Korea, South Korea, the next logical question is China, and that, when the US deployed missile defense systems, a defense system to South Korea, China was quite not happy with it and hit Korea with sanctions. Certainly if the US redeploys nuclear weapons, whether tactical or strategic, are going, Beijing is not going to have a great response to that. How do you see China's response to that option? And then how do you see Korea's response to China's response? I mean, is there a trepidation within within Seoul, within the Korean people, that if the US actually does redeploy nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula, that it's really going to harm, Korean-Chinese relations?
Yeah, actually, that's the kind of logical kind of considerations. If we if United States deploy tactical nuclear weapons, then we have to also considering joining this missile defense, other ISR, other related technological cooperations with the United States, which will kind of anger China, because as you mentioned in 2016, only deploying that kind of provoking China to impose economic sanctions on South Korea. But things are pretty changed since then. South Koreans perceive China very hostile way. And when you look at this kind of favorability rating in the survey data, China is the #1, who actually most hated by South Korean public. It's much higher than North Korea, which is pretty kind of concerning. And also North Korea and China alignment and North Korea Russian alignment is pretty concerning, as especially after North Korea sent kind of their own troops to Ukraine or kind of territory. So all of this tragic environment has been pretty concerning for South Korean public. So even though we are kind of deploying tactical nuclear weapons and also joining this missile defense system, the kind of provocation from South Korean public is much less, I think, compared to 2016 STAT deployment cases.
Yeah, I want to touch on sort of creative solutions, more creative solutions to burden sharing. There's this very narrow view that I think the Trump administration has had in the past of it's just kind of top line numbers, it's cost sharing numbers, it's billions of dollars. But I think that expanding the view of what burden sharing actually means or what can mean is actually going to be quite more beneficial to U.S. defense policy. And Kuyan, you touched on, Will, I want to get your perspectives on this as well. But we've talked, Trump has talked about how can the U.S. leverage Korean shipyards better, and Korea and Japan both have much more healthy shipbuilding industry than the U.S. does. What can Korea and Japan offer to the U.S. as these countries enter these tough negotiations, and how enticing is that actually to U.S. defense policy? Kuyan, if you want to hop on that first.
Well, the shipbuilding industry is not just about kind of, building, make a ship or kind of repair a ship. South Korean perspective is that we are participating in this defense industrial ecosystems in the United States, which already will be the target of China, I think. So even though it is just kind of economic regions, I think kind of joining this, for instance, like a regional sustain initiative suggested by DoD last year, it's a kind of good kind of cases. South Korea is willing to join that network, not only because for the economic reason, but also for the security strategic region as well. So I think that could serve as a good leverage. We are contributing United States security and United States interest in strengthening and resilience of the alliance's system. So in that sense, I think that could be a good leverage in kind of negotiating SMA or kind of burden sharing. And one thing South Korea worries is that burden sharing is not just about cost sharing. As many participants already mentions, we are kind of considering, not worrying, considering about the possibility of time contingency as well. It has been a hot button issue in South Korea last year. And official position of South Korea is that we are kind of maintaining stability on the Korean peninsula, if that's the case. But that still is pretty a good kind of huge burden because kind of conventional deterrence against North Korea, even if we are backed by United States, is pretty costly if something happens on the Korean Peninsula, while United States kind of diverted to Taiwan and Korean Peninsula, and also possibly Japan. So that kind of situation is also concerning in terms of burden sharing for South Korea. So all of these things, not just co-sharing, are kind of calculating South Korean mind.
Yeah. Well, how do you see this with, shipyards, co-production? I mean, there's already a start to some of these with, missiles as well as shipyards. But how do you see, the advancement of these initiatives, and how do you think the U.S. can better leverage these as they're looking towards, maximizing what they can out of Japan?
Sure. Yeah. I think on defense and also sort of the broader appeal that I think Prime Minister Ishiba is going to make towards President Trump later this week, a lot of it is going to be on foreign military sales. So I think that in terms of that goes into sort of the licensing production of Patriot surface air missiles for missile defense, as well as I think the recent agreement to sell air-to-air missiles to Japan, the AMRAAM air-to-air missiles to Japan. And I think part of this is also, I think this has to be sort of framed in the sense of the U.S. defense industrial base simply cannot match the sort of the consumption of missiles that it needs, both in terms of itself, its allies like Israel, ongoing conflicts in Ukraine. And I think, really Japan should be seen not just as a foreign military sales customer, but also as a way to sort of relieve some of the burdens for the United States, right? As we focus on sort of replenishing our stocks, Japan can take on a larger role in manufacturing these kind of missiles. At the same time, depending on how fungible it is, as the U.S. Sort of proceeds on its own sort of renewal of its own nuclear missile force, again, these are capacity that Japan can take on and free up American defense industrial capacity to take on these larger, more strategic level type sort of preparations. So that's one thing. The other part is really in terms of investment, right? So obviously, I think the Japanese government has been trying to find ways to sort of expand and encourage Japanese defense industry to sort of expand capacity and have more greater faith. I think traditionally the defense industry in Japan has not been a profitable venture. It's always been done really on sort of a patriotic sort of national basis. It has never really been severely profitable. But in light of Japan's more recent shift towards expanding its defense budget, the Japanese government has expanded, I think, the profit margins for defense articles from 8 to 15%, which is a positive step. But I think long term, Japanese defense industries has to sort of look abroad, right? They can't just simply rely on the Japanese domestic market or the needs of the Japanese government, right? Because that is causing them to be skeptical about, Japan's willingness to sustain its increased defense spending. And so I think Japanese defense companies have to look abroad. And in many ways, they kind of have to look to examples like Hanwha Shipping, right? Who have sort of established a presence in the United States, first in the Philadelphia shipyard and likely one in the West Coast in the future. And I think, this creates a lot of challenges in terms of corporate governance, regulations, and security issues. But I think long term, for the Japanese defense industry to be much more profitable and viable, they have to make these investments both at home and abroad and expand capacity and their ability to participate in these larger allied shared initiatives. And I think I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, Mike, I want to get to Taiwan on this as well, and kind of going back to that, that point of the U.S. Taiwan relationship is so special and different that there's certain limits to creative solutions to burden sharing, but it's not totally impossible. I think Trump, and let me know if you disagree with this characterization, but I think Trump likes to link a lot of these issues together as far as security, burden sharing, and trade. Taiwan does a lot of semiconductor manufacturing, and there's a huge push in the U.S. for more semiconductor manufacturing. How do you think, how do you see creative solutions to burden sharing that Taiwan can offer to Washington that might entice them to lessen their kind of top line, demands on defense spending?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just push back against the framework of the question or the framing of the question for a moment. I think burden sharing is the wrong way to think about the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, only because there is no treaty, right? There is no legalized commitment. And so, technically speaking, the burden is all Taiwan's. And I think that's how Taiwan typically has to approach these issues. That being said, I think the concerns about Taiwanese defense spending are fair. I think that they do give reason to certain folks within the Trump orbit to argue that the Taiwanese are just counting on the United States to come and save the day in the event of a conflict. So what other ways to allay those concerns besides increasing defense spending? The first thing I say is Taiwan does need to increase defense spending. It's been promising for over 2 decades now that it would hit 3% of GDP, and it has failed. Until recently, I'd say it has failed because it hasn't tried. There's been positive steps again over the last 8 years or so, but we're not there yet. That aside, to the extent that we can find opportunities to cooperate in the chip space, which is obviously a comparative advantage for Taiwan, that's great. But President Trump has also indicated he sees that that industry is something that Taiwan has stolen, and Taiwan has no desire to give away the crown jewels, so to speak. And so I'm skeptical that Taiwan and Taiwanese industry can go far enough there to really satisfy the Trump administration. So I think it would be worth Taiwan looking to really step up the sorts of to do a couple of things. Step up intelligence cooperation with the United States. We already do this, but Taiwan arguably understands both the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, better than any other country in the world, apart from China. It's been their one mission, their one enemy that they had to worry about for the entirety of the existence of the ROC on Taiwan. And so, to the extent that Taiwan is able to offer more of its own insights on what China is doing, why it's doing those things, how it is operating to allow the United States to operate more effectively and more safely and securely in the region, I think that's a positive. Taiwan also, of course, has pretty crucial real estate, and we have seen an increase in U.S. Forces on Taiwan, still small, operating quietly. But if there are opportunities to welcome more such activities that the Trump administration would be open to, allowing the Trump administration to more closely keep an eye on what China is up to in the region, that might be attractive. But again, that could also feed into the argument that that Taiwan is simply relying on the United States. I don't think there are easy solutions here when it comes to Taiwan and its handling of the Trump administration.
Yeah, and I guess, last question for the night and kind of ending on a, big picture is, how do you think Trump, Taiwan policy is actually going to develop over the next 4 years? And that, Rubio and Waltz and Hegseth, kind of seem, to be in line on with a lot of kind of standard Republican policy, but a lot of Trump staffers that are, being put into pretty senior positions at state and DOD don't necessarily see, their U.S. commitments to Taiwan in the same way. They don't see the U.S.-China relationship in the same way as a Rubio or Waltz do. There's kind of a lot of talk about a grand bargain with China over Taiwan. What are your predictions overall on how the Trump Taiwan policy is actually going to develop?
I don't know. So the first thing I would say is look back to the first Trump administration, and I would argue that there was a lot of troubling rhetoric, both in public and we later learned in private, things like President Trump is essentially saying Taiwan's too small and too far away to defend. There's nothing we can do to help them. But as far as action, there was a lot of good things. So again, regularizing the arms sales process, increasing arms sales to Taiwan, treating Taiwan more like a normal diplomatic partner in ways that I think has symbolic and substantive value. So there were a lot of good developments during the first Trump term. I think that strongly. I think in this next term, you're going to see. I think there's, broadly speaking, I think there's sort of three competing factions is the wrong word. Three competing arguments that are existing or will exist within the Trump administration if everybody ends up where they are expected to end up. So you pointed to certainly Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Waltz. I think we're a little bit less clear on Pete Hegseth's views, but yes, more traditional approach to U.S. foreign policy, one that recognizes the importance of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship and recognizes the importance of maintaining Taiwan's de facto independence. Bridge Colby, who's been nominated to serve as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, agrees with them on the importance of Taiwan's de facto independence. He looks at this very much through a geographic, geostrategic lens. But he also is, and he has said this publicly, is in favor of the U.S. and China finding a sustainable balance of power. He doesn't seem to have a problem with China's hegemony, or at least doesn't think it's worth trying to upset that hegemony. And so that leads you to different places when it comes to Taiwan. He's also adopted a much more, or willingness to be much more confrontational when it comes to the U.S.-Taiwan relationship in particular, to coerce Taiwan to spending more and to spending their money in certain ways. And then I think you'll have the, again, for lack of a better term, sort of the protectionist group, which is concerned primarily with trade issues, which won't like the trade imbalance with Taiwan, which sees Taiwan as having stolen the American chip industry and perhaps other industries as well. And I don't know how those three get balanced, how those fights turn out over the next 4 years. My hope is that we see continued, gradual, quiet progress in a positive direction, and that a lot of the sort of the loud stuff that gets attention turns out to be not all that impactful, but only time will tell.
Yeah, maybe we'll all have to meet in 4 years and have a retrospective event on, where policy went. But I want to thank all my participants here tonight to join me for this conversation, as well as our attendees. If you're looking to learn more about FPRI, you can go to fpri.org for our research and events. But I want to thank Will, Mike, and Kuyan for joining me tonight, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your night.
Thanks, Connor.
Thanks a lot.